To the Adri Foundation Lecture 2014. Over the last few years, the Asian Development Research Institute has had the privilege of hosting leading thinkers from across the world. Speakers at past Adri Foundation lectures have included Professor Kamal Desai, Professor Joseph Stiglitz. Continuing in the same tradition, we today have Lord Meghnad Desai, who will talk on the topic, Can Poverty Ever Be Abolished? We also have the honor of the company of the former Chief Minister of Bihar, Shri Nitish Kumar, who has kindly agreed to preside over the lecture. Without much further ado, I would like to declare the lecture open. First by a small presentation of bouquets to our esteemed guests. I now request Dr. Shaival Gupta, the founding member secretary of Asian Development Research Institute, to deliver the welcome address.
Lord Meghnad Desai, our honored guest this evening, Sri Bijendra Prasad Jadhav ji, the Honorable Finance Minister, Sri Vijay Kumar Chaudhary ji, the Honorable Water Resource Minister, Sri Ramlakhan Raman ji, Honorable Minister of Mines, Sri Harivansh ji, Honorable Member of Parliament, Professor Anjan Mukherjee, Professor Prabhat Ghosh, distinguished members of Indian Administrative Service, from Indian Police Service, from different faculty, from different universities, Professor Gopa Sabharwal, distinguished faculty members and dear students of Nalanda University, ladies and gentlemen, it is great pleasure for me to welcome Lord Meghnad Desai and you all to this Adri Foundation lecture of 2014. We have been organizing these lectures since 1992, through which some of the best minds in the world in their respective fields have shared their valuable ideas with the intelligentsia of Patna. The appeal of this lecture in the past has been strong and wide, both because of untrodden nature of topics as well as the eminence of the speakers. We know for sure that the intelligentsia of Patna look towards these lectures with high expectations. Asian Development Research Institute was established in 1991 for carrying out development research both in theoretical dimension and empirical embellishments. Besides bringing the development issues to the fore, Adri also seeks to integrate the generation of idea with the implementation of idea. We realize that both for strengthening the vitals of democracy and pursuing the agenda of development, the establishment of knowledge society based on knowledge capital is of prime importance. In this era of globalization, where opportunities are many, but the competition is tough, the role of knowledge capital is even more. In this perspective, the rationale for organizing the Adri Foundation lecture is to generate such knowledge capital in a place like Bihar. During the last 2 decades, a number of eminent scholars have made us proud by agreeing to deliver foundation lecture. Some of them are Professor Randesh Singh, Professor Prabhat Patnaik, Professor Deepak Nayyar, Professor Amiyo Bakchi, Professor Shahid Amin, Sri Ashok Bajpai, Professor Francine Frankel, Professor Barbara Harris White, Professor Amart Sen. Last year we had Professor Joseph Stiglitz for our foundation lecture, and this year we have yet another distinguished scholar, Lord Meghnad Desai. It is a great moment for us that all foundation lectures have been delivered by outstanding scholars who have shaped our understanding of development and helped us to identify our development strategies. The topic of today's lecture, Can Poverty Be Abolished?, is indeed extremely relevant in the present context of Indian economy. Ever since Professor Dandekar and Rath had first estimated the poverty ratio in India in the early 70s, based on NSS consumer expenditure data, a public debate on the veracity of the estimate as well as the efficacy of our poverty-reducing interventions have been regular phenomena, involving both professional economists and public figures like political leaders. Such debates are indeed welcome, as it could lead to better estimates of poverty, a clear understanding of the phenomena, and better strategies to abolish it. But unfortunately, in India, these debates have been rather inconsequential, as most participants in the debates have not cared to understand either the theoretical or the statistical base of poverty estimates. In today's lecture, Lord Desai would guide us through an extremely enlightening discourse on alternative definitions of income, varying practices across the nations regarding fixation of necessary normative poverty lines, and the consequent varying estimates of poverty ratio. With empirical evidence, he shows how poverty line is both income elastic, as income goes up, so does poverty line, and conscious elastic, as people become richer, they tend to allow more for the poor. Friends, I have no intention of foretelling Lord Desai, and I am as much eager to listen to him as all of you are on this absorbing topic of whether poverty can ever be abolished. I again thank him for agreeing to enlighten us on these vital economic challenges. Friends, during 2016 and 17, RG will be celebrating the Silver Jubilee year. Apart from major development conference and few Silver Jubilee lectures, the celebration will be extended to next year to host two important conferences, first on the centenary of October Revolution and the second on the bicentenary of Karl Marx. Our celebration will also include two national conferences, one in memory of our one-time chairperson, Dr. Arvindarayan Das, and other in honor of Professor P.P. Ghosh. Lord Desai has agreed to become the chairman of the celebration committee, which will include a number of national and international dignitaries. I sincerely thank him for this valuable support to our organization. At this point, I have great news to share with you all. RG has now been recognized by the Indian Council of Social Science Research. We went through a highly standardized and rigorous selection process, and we are happy that we came out successful. I now would like to welcome all dignitaries who have come here to listen to Lord Meghnad Desai and also encourage us. But I especially welcome Honorable Sri Nitish Kumar ji, who has kindly agreed to preside over this function. Many of you may remember that in 2007, it was Sri Nitish Kumar ji who was motivating brain behind an international seminar on revisiting the poverty issues, measurement, identification, and eradication at Patna. The seminar had ended with the Patna Declaration on Poverty, leading to some major changes in government's poverty alleviation strategy. Would inform us where do we stand now on this important development agenda. We at RG have been very fortunate to receive his support and guidance in recent years. By being here this afternoon, he has further boosted our morale. Friends, I also welcome Among us, Professor Gopal Sabharwal, the Vice Chancellor of the Nalanda International University. She is here with all the faculty members of the university and its students. They are all welcome here. I must mention here that Lord Meghnad Desai have played a very valuable role in the establishment of the Nalanda International University. I am sure the contribution of Lord Desai would be remembered for many, many years after the university takes its final shape. Incidentally, Sri Nitish Kumar ji had also played a critical and major role for the establishment of the university. With these words, I welcome you all and again request Professor Anjan Mukherjee, Chairman of our Academic Advisory Board and Country Director of International Growth Center at ADRI, to present before you the outstanding academic profile of Lord Meghnad Desai. Thank you.
Sri Nitish Kumar ji, distinguished invitees, ladies and gentlemen. It's a privilege and honor to introduce Professor Lord Meghnad Desai, Professor Emeritus at the London School of Economics, a Labour peer, member of the governing body of Nalanda University, and a prolific writer on economic and other matters. Baron Desai was born as Meghnad Jagdish Chandra Desai on July 10, 1940, in Vadodara in Gujarat. His father was employed in the Baroda government, while his mother was a housewife. He had 4 siblings, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. His parents expected great things from him, and as it turned out, their expectations were met. Unfortunately, his mother died very early, and this affected young Meghnad. He secured a master's degree in economics from the University of Mumbai, used to be called Bombay then, I guess, and then won a scholarship to study at the University of Pennsylvania during the period 61-63, where he obtained his PhD degree, working under Larry Klein. I guess, so that's not incorrect. He was also a Nobel laureate, as it turned out later on. Meghnad Desai, in the early stages of his career, was quite well-known applied economist. But his interest in Marxian economics was also well established. He was appointed to a teaching position in the LSE in 1965. Taught econometrics, macroeconomics, Marxian economics, and development economics. His first book in 1973 was on Marxian economics, and the book on applied econometrics followed soon thereafter. In this sense, he was quite unusual. Scholars specializing in Marxian economics usually took history as the other main discipline, whereas Meghnad Desai relied on quantitative analysis. And in this, he was very much like another great LSE economist, Professor Michio Morishima. He published a critique on monetarism in the early 80s. He was a popular teacher in the LSE and was no ivory tower scholar. He wrote regularly columns in magazines and newspapers like the Tribune, the Indian Express, the Financial Express, and so on. He was also editor of a fairly professional journal, the Journal of Applied Econometrics. He was politically quite active, was a member of the British Labour Party, and was in fact its chairman as well during 86 to 92. In 1991, he was made a life peer as Baron Desai of St. Clement Danes in the city of Westminster. If I remember correctly, St. Clement's was also the name of the building we sat in those years. He was also honored by the government of India with the title of Padma Bhushan in 2008, one of the top civilian honors of our government. Moving to more academic matters, his 2002 book, Marx's Revenge, The Resurgence of Capitalism and the Death of Statist Socialism, was justly famous. In this book, he argues that not only is globalization Marx been around, he would have applauded the spread of globalization, and that this was exactly what he would have blessed, and rejected reactionary the anti-globalization movements which were spreading about the world. Now this contrary view, of course, caught people's imagination and their interest. In 2003, he retired as the director of the Center for Study of Global Governance, which he founded in 1992 at the LSE. Lord Desai was also a founding member of the Development Studies Institute at the LSE in 1990. Now, since his retirement, if you thought that his work was finished, look at what he published. He published a book, Rethinking Islamism, Ideology of the New Terror, 2006, The Root to All Evil, The Political Economy of Ezra Pound, 2007, and novel titled Dead on Time, 2009, and The Rediscovery of India, 2009. It's clear that we have the privilege to have with us a prodigious scholar and a multifaceted personality. Before ending, I'd like to add one other facet of this original thinker which sets him apart. Dilip Kumar had a huge impact on Baron Desai. In an autobiographical piece that he published in the Times of India, he acknowledged that his book, Nehru's Hero, Dilip Kumar in the Life of India, as his greatest achievement. Not only that, and this I'm quoting him, I'm not making this up, while in college, he often serenaded his fellow classmates by singing Dil Tarap Tarap Ke. Unfortunately, he claims that their dil did not tarap. I do not know whether this is actually true, but I'm just quoting Baron Desai on this. I'll not stand any longer between you and the speaker, Professor Lord Meghnad Desai.
Thank you, Anjan. That's for friends of all. I'm greatly honored to have Sri Nitish Kumar be here. If I have come to Bihar more or less constantly over the last 10 or more years, it has been mainly as a result of first his invitation to come to Global Bihar, and since then his invitation to come and be active in the Nalanda University Foundation movement. And so I'm very much pleased that he is here on the occasion of my Adri Foundation lecture. And of course, I always say no matter who is in power, Saibal Gupta runs Bihar. So he's there, and he's been a very good friend. There are many, many distinguished invitees here. I apologize, I cannot acknowledge everybody by their name, but thank you very much for coming here. And I hope your afternoon is not wasted listening to me. Okay, now the problem I wish to discuss is, can be described as the following. Historically, for many, many centuries, people accepted poverty as a matter of life. It was partly a matter of your luck, your karma, or whatever it is, and maybe it went from generation to generation. For some people, poverty, adoption of poverty voluntarily was a great virtue. Saints and munis and yogis often accepted poverty as a virtue. The idea that poverty can be removed really comes after the Industrial Revolution. Industrial Revolution is the first time with capitalism that people begin to notice that there is so much plenty around that there is no reason why some people should be so deprived. And it's very interesting that one of the pioneers of poverty was a very prosperous merchant called Charles Booth. And he was walking around East End of London and noticed that children were playing truant. They were not at school. And so he asked them why they were not at school, and they said their families could not afford to send them to school. In those days, primary education was not free in England. although it was the richest country then in the world. He then further inquired into their family circumstances and he made up family budgets. And he realized that the family expenditure on food and clothing and housing was such that the family could not spare the 4 pence a month which was required to send the children to school. So the first sort of idea that poverty is deprivation comes from actually not starvation so much as lack of education for children. Then another very rich and sort of generous man called C.B. Rowntree. He, whose family made chocolates, among other things. He spent a lot of his time camping in the city of York, and he collected data on people's budgets, family spending, to find out where was the cutoff line in between, how were different people living and what they were spending on necessities and luxuries, vices, things like that. And so originally the idea that we should do something about poverty has almost like a direct experiential content. People saw poverty, they asked about it, and then said, okay, what can we do to remove it? Now, what then really happens is that it's in America, like in many other things, that President Roosevelt decides during the Great Depression that all Americans should have at least enough to eat. And there was no standard of what is enough to eat, except in American prisons. American prisons had laid down that every prisoner ought to have 3,200 calories. And that was it's also an interesting thing that when Dadabai Naoroji was doing his pioneering work on poverty, he says that the only standard of housing, what is adequate housing, was laid down in the Prison Act. And he found out that many, many people who were not in prison did not have enough accommodation that the people in jail had. And that's one way he defined poverty. Anyway, so then Roosevelt decided 3,200 calories was too much. Prisoners had to do hard work. But, the rest of the citizens could have 500 calories less than that. And that standard was converted into a family budget. What sort of food gives you that? And from then on, we have had this practice of drawing a poverty line. So many calories, find out what sort of foods people would eat or should eat to secure that many calories. And whatever that costs, you take that number and say, well, people spend maybe 1/3 of the total income on food, therefore whatever this is, 3 times that is a poverty line. Now, I'm saying all this because I don't know, those of you who follow Indian public debates, periodically there is a poverty line published, 32 rupees per day in urban India and 25 rupees per day in rural India. And all sorts of scandal breaks out among politicians, and someone say, if I go to a dhaba, it costs me so much to buy a samosa, and my friend Arnab Goswami shouts at me and saying, for 32 rupees, all I can get is a slice of bread and butter and a cup of tea. Do you call that a poverty line? And it's very surprising that people know very little about how the poor live. And they know very little about what the poverty line is about. But they're all scandalized that it is too low. At the same time, everybody in Indian politics believes that the poverty estimate, that year after year, we have been having, sort of every 5 years, we have been having a poverty measurement. All politicians believe that it is an underestimate and we ought to be more poor, or rather we are more poor than we suspect. So this is sort of a phenomenon. Although the people who do these measurements are very honest, straightforward people, and they actually know what the poor eat, more than most politicians do. But there is a problem here that we have in India also been very unhappy about what we contain in the poverty basket. So, this was originally, as Saibal Gupta mentioned, work by Dandekar and Rath based on so many calories. Then there was a revision by Lakdawala, D.T. Lakdawala, my professor, when he was deputy chairman of Planning Commission. And then Suresh Tendulkar, he revised the poverty a little bit upwards. And every now and then we feel that, the poverty line ought to be raised. Now, this is very kind of noble sentiment. But what it really says to us, that originally our worry was that nobody should starve. That was sort of the baseline of poverty. But as our per capita income goes up, we raise the poverty line. And so, in a sense, poverty line becomes income elastic. As per capita income goes up, the poverty line goes up. And then another phenomenon happens, which is that people say, it is not about just eating. It's not about food and clothing and things like that. It is about education of children. It is about your leisure activities. Are you deprived in terms of your cyber technology? Have you got such and such access to various facilities? So on. As we get better off, we want the poor to have a better life as well. So what I call the poverty line is conscience elastic. Our consciences tell us that the poverty line ought to be more and more generous. Now, the problem with doing this is that ultimately we will always have a poverty line going up as our income goes up. And so abolishing poverty is a never-ending struggle. And I really sort of wanted to raise a question as to whether this is really a way of thinking about poverty. The question is not what should be ideally the minimum standard. The problem is, what did we start doing when we first decided that poverty is something which should be abolished? And it's very interesting that you find that even in very rich countries, no matter how much economic growth you have, poverty is never abolished. In America, the poverty that the latest number I saw is 15% for the whole population. And among Hispanic and black communities, it is sort of in the higher 20 percentile range. And so, technically speaking, the Indian poverty numbers in 2013, which was 21.9, is lower than the poverty among the black and Hispanic people in America. And we ought to really ask questions about what is this? Is it really that we have an idea that there is an absolute standard of not being poor? Calories. Or is it, as another distinguished sociologist, a friend of mine, Professor Peter Townsend, had the idea, basically, don't measure poverty by calories. Go around and ask people, what do you think is poverty? What do you, as a member of the community, think everybody ought to have, at least at the minimum? So have a community-based standard of poverty. And if the community says, poverty is 2 meals a day, or 3 meals a day, whatever it is. What is a meal? Well, dal chawal, roti dal chawal, sabzi. It is for people to decide. And then you say, that is the poverty line. So, there are very many ways of thinking about poverty, none of which is entirely correct. But ultimately, we have to ask ourselves what it is that we are seeking when we say poverty ought to be eradicated or abolished. I mean, in a very interesting way, you could say one thing. Take the calorie standard. Why is it uniform? Why do we think everybody ought to have 2,200 calories? regardless of age, gender, health condition, anything like that, or even the amount of work people do. You know, in Latin America, they have poverty measures in which different members of the family have a different calorific standard. And even the calorific standard changes as the health conditions change, especially pregnant women and women bringing up babies and lactating mothers. They are allowed a higher calorific standard than as people get old, they're allowed a lower calorific standard, and so on. In a sense, we ought to actually take interest in the people we are trying to get out of poverty than just have a uniform standard. The problem with uniform standard is that it is very convenient for people who want to measure poverty. It gives you a number, a single number. The the World Bank thinks whatever it is, $1.25 at purchasing power parity is a poverty standard for everybody in the world. Well, it's got a staggering position to take. There's a single number which measures the poverty standard of everybody around the world. And, by that standard, India has slightly higher level of poverty than what the NSS standard says. And the World Bank also says that if they put that thing at $5 per day, 96% of Indians would be poor. So, I mean, that makes you think what a peculiar thing this is. Now, in a sense, one of the things is that in measuring poverty as uniform across individuals and across families, across households, we gain comparability among different countries and maybe comparability over time. But I think we actually lose the idea of what it is that we set out to do. And I'm particularly, I want to bring your attention to a very recent study by the Asian Development Bank. Indeed, was only released about a fortnight ago. The Asian Development Bank has decided that $1.25 is just not good enough. It should at least be $1.51. How somebody comes to 51 rather than 50 is beyond me, but suppose they do. 51 cents. And then they say that if you do that, let me sort of not mislead you, let me give you some numbers which I have written down somewhere. The poverty proportion goes up from 20% to 30%. 10 percentage points are added to the poverty numbers if you just raise a thing. And then they say, but this is really not good enough because for the poor, food prices matter more than other prices, so we ought to observe the extra weight for food prices. And then they say the real problem is vulnerability, because if there's a flood or famine or health condition, people suffer. So if you say that income should be such that not only there should be enough calories, but that there should be guaranteed that regardless of food prices, there should be enough, and there should be. It turns out that Asian poverty rates is not 20%, but it is 50%. Now, we've been saying to the world that Asian growth experience has been so dynamic that for the first time in millennia, Asian poverty is down. Now we know Asian poverty is not down. Asian poverty is actually 50% of the population. Again, the question is, what is it that we're doing here in trying to measure poverty in the way we have done? And I just want to throw out a couple of ideas about this. I mean, it obviously seems very callous to question that people do not need all these things. And, why should I deny that Asian poverty is 50%? Why do I think people are not poor? My problem is that if you look at people's daily experience, some sort of ups and downs in consumption experience is part of life. Very many families in any year would be technically going in and out of poverty line even from 1 week to next, 1 month to next, or whatever happens. I mean, I remember from the circumstances that Anjan described, my father had a sort of, a clerical job in Baroda. But last week of month was always bad. Okay, we were not poor, but last week of the month was a thing in which certain kinds of vegetables could not be bought because vegetables were expensive. I mean, things like, we know things like that. And in Bihar, I hardly need say that people have to adjust to floods and famines and droughts and things like that. Now, I would say the way we ought to look at it is, how do people manage? How do people manage their consumption experience? How do they adjust? It is not about uniformity of certain standards and say, if you fall below that, you're gone. If you're above that, you're all right. Neither up nor down are you ever completely all right. But the question would be, what is the kind of thing we want people to, what sort of life experience we want people to have, in which we would say, okay, this is something that we think is adequate, and that gives us an idea of, if people fall below that, what is the kind of compensation schemes we should be devising which would take care of these fluctuations up and down. For example, a bad health experience, or a drought, or a famine. And if we were to study consumption experiences of families practically in the field, that might give us a better idea. The poverty line is not a single fixed line. It is wobbling around, as with life experience. And we really have to devise more intelligent strategies to be able to compensate people for these short-run fluctuations in consumption experience if we are going to try and tackle the problem of poverty. Because ultimately, I think, and I don't want to take much more of your time than this, ultimately I think we have a certain sort of insurance idea in our mind. We want to ensure that our society is so organized that as many people as possible do not fall in such a state that their livelihoods are really threatened, or as few people as possible have really precarious livelihoods over a period of 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. We may also ask intergenerational questions about the opportunities for children and so on. Those are not necessarily questions of poverty, they are questions of future income. But I think we have to concentrate on the core problems of poverty and try and prevent those problems of poverty, while at the same time making quite sure that the poor get some dividend of the growth we have. So my ideal would be we should always keep a minimal standard of poverty. I mean, if you're going to have a uniform standard, if you're going to have a uniform line, and I don't think that any government is going to go beyond having a uniform line, I think we ought to ask ourselves the question, by the standards of 1970s which we started off, have we at least managed to eliminate poverty of that time in 50 years? Have we then managed to eliminate poverty of what we thought poverty line was 40 years ago, 30 years ago, and have a sort of series of marked achievement things? If we have not achieved elimination of poverty, even as our imaginations were in 1970, then we've really failed. But if we are failing in relation to our expectations as of 2000 or 2010, at least we have come thus far, and the fact that we have overcome the previous standards, gives us hope that we are not doing badly, we are on the right track. So I think we do need some kind of nuanced approach. We need to know that a single line is not a very adequate idea. We need more study of consumption behavior. We need also this backward and forward-looking measurement so that we know that, yes, poverty may never be abolished because we never want to abolish poverty. We want to be so ambitious in our idea that ultimately the notion of abolition of poverty is really a notion of a just income distribution. And that may never be achieved, but we will go under. But while we are aiming high, let's make quite sure that we have climbed some steps relative to where we were. I think a society needs both a sense of achievement and a aspiration. I think we have to have both. We can't have one without the other. Thank you.
We now have some time for questions for Lord Desai. So please feel free to raise your hand and we'll pass the mic around.
Lord Desai, thank you for a very enlightening talk. I just want to draw you away from the sterile world of 25 rupees, 30 rupees, and perhaps give a more multidisciplinary context for your talk. And this is the social context, and we are told that in democracies, to ensure that majority doesn't become majority, institutions are required. In the context which we live in, apart from the obvious institutions of the judiciary, which you require to control the instincts of majoritarianism, what other institutions would you consider essential, and how could we retain them to make sure that we can never abolish poverty in India?
By reading of Indian political history, and especially my reading of what happened during the emergency, is that there are two kinds of possible pitfalls that a democracy may face. One is a single party dominance, an overwhelming single party dominance. And other is majoritarianism in the sense in which you describe it. Now, when we actually started on our experience, we were never worried about Congress ever being a danger to democracy because we had faith. We had faith that this party was a guardian of democracy. And as it happened historically in all our lifetimes, there was emergency. And I think it was an extremely formative experience of Indian democracy. That a party which had won the election overwhelmingly, and there's no doubt about that, felt so threatened that it resorted to overcoming democracy, or the Prime Minister felt so threatened, and the Prime Minister felt threatened by the judiciary. And all the judiciary had said was very mildly saying, please step down and do not vote in Lok Sabha while your case is pending. Now, that I think, and I think, who am I to speak to, sitting next to Nitishji, that I think has profoundly affected Indian expectations of democracy and Indian political behavior. That's one issue. Although the Constitution was tampered with very badly, the Constitution survived. And Indian democracy survived an emergency. Secondly, I know that people are worried about majoritarianism. I have always thought that it was impossible to build Hindus into a single voting bloc. The great saving grace of Indian democracy is that the Hindus are not a monolithic saving bloc. Hindus have never been a monolithic anything. And in a sense, if I may take the 1 minute to develop that, imagine a society which survived several millennia without a strong political authority. Why did Hindu society survive millennia with its structure intact without a strong political authority? Even when there was a so-called hostile Muslim authority ruling India, Hindu society survived completely intact with all its caste divisions, all its religion. I think the strength is the fact that there has never been a single cohesive group which has dominated over the rest of it. Now that means I'm not trying to evade your question. What I'm trying to say that given the experience of emergency and given the way I think of Hindu society, I mean, if you meet three Hindus, there'll be two divisions among them at least. There may be three if you're lucky, but that will be UP and Bihar, but not anywhere else. So, it is not like that. It is not a society given to building up large uniform voting blocks, which can then be said, which is why I think initially the Ram Janmabhoomi thing didn't actually succeed as much as this has always been a problem of the BJP. How come in a Hindu majority nation, a Hindu nationalist party cannot win votes? They finally won it not by playing a Hindu card, but by playing a development card, development and governance card, helped by the disaster of the previous government. So, okay, I'm not being sanguine, but I think there's a lot going for Indian democracy, and I don't think we have too much to fear. And if push comes to shove, the country will not stand for majoritarianism. It just will not.
Professor Desai, enlightenment approach with honest listen to you. And entirely on a personal note, when I was in 2003-4 at LSE, I could manage to meet you for just few minutes. Yeah. And that was one of the greatest days. So I always probably remember that. But you would not, because there would be many students who teach you at that time. But coming back to your great lecture, if I got you correctly, there's a brilliant, a kind of a dilemma that you tried to expound. But people in the society started with a certain understanding of poverty and alignment. And they might have abolished it. Why to kind of denigrate that achievement? By kind of changing expectations and aspirations. So let's have two conceptual norms to exist together. One to look at that we started about the starvation dimension, so much of calories, perhaps we have achieved. Now maybe there's expectation, as you said, moving towards better income distribution, hence more on health, more on education, more on shelter. But I have this problem with this formulation, that, after all, the norms of poverty may change over time. What was thought to be poverty in terms of just ensuring that people do not fall in the destitute category in flood, genuinely can change over time. At that time, perhaps people should have also thought of education and shelter. That might have been a problem of intellectual, discourse, that they looked at the most obvious starvation, but they couldn't conceptualize. So I would argue, perhaps, just as counterfactual, that even at that time, the poverty should have been conceptualized by combining other parameters also. And therefore, if this has advanced now as a kind of, as you said, conscious, plastic or concept, a brilliant foundation. Now that evolves over time, and now we have a perhaps more holistic conceptualization. Then while we may celebrate that there was some level of understanding which we might have achieved, but we must still value this norm. And quickly, the second point related to it, that it will be also essential to look into that additional factors, for example, if the health and we have already pointed, if they are not available.
आपने वॉलंटरी पॉवर्टी की बात की थी और महात्मा गांधी का एक बहुत प्रसिद्ध कथन है जो हम लोग बार बार जगह जगह कोट करते हैं कि यह पृथ्वी जो है वो हर आदमी की ज़रूरत पूरी कर सकती है लेकिन किसी एक की भी लालच नहीं। तो ये जो लाइन ऑफ थिंकिंग है इसको आप किस तरह से देखते हैं और ये जो मटेरियल एस्पिरेशन और दूसरे प्रकार का एस्पिरेशन एजुकेशनल है या कुछ और है, इसमें जो डिफरेंस है उसको आप पॉवर्टी एबॉलिशन के संदर्भ में कैसे देखते हैं?
बात यह है कि उसमें कुछ सच्चाई है, मगर मेरे ख्याल से बहुत लिमिटेड सच्चाई है। पृथ्वी जो कर सकती है उस पर कोई सीमा नहीं। जब हमें एक टेक्नोलॉजी मिले, जब हमें रिसोर्स, जब हमें ज्ञान मिले, तो हम पृथ्वी जो कर सकते वो बहुत बढ़ा सकते हैं। तो जो मिले उससे संतुष्ट होने का कोई कारण नहीं, हमें असंतुष्ट रहना चाहिए, क्योंकि हमें ये उम्मीद है कि हम हर जनरेशन से आगे बढ़े और लोगों को और भी दे सके। पृथ्वी जो कर सकती है उसको भी बढ़ाए। हाँ, ये आपने जो बात कही वो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की बात है कि जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन होता है वो सही नहीं। और पॉवर्टी की जो बात है वो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की बात के साथ जुड़ी हुई है, मगर ये भी है कि एक लिमिट नहीं। Earth's resources are not limited. The capacity of mankind to have prosperity is not limited. That is why I was saying that it is only after the Industrial Revolution that it became possible to imagine the abolition of poverty.
Lecture. My name is Ghanshyam Tiwari. My question is that can poverty ever be abolished? This is the point of view of government that sees poverty in a timeless fashion. But when you look at it from the perspective of a family, it is not a timeless battle, it is a day-to-day battle. Have you come across policy ideas that look at can poverty ever be abolished for a day, for a week, for a month, especially given that economy lives in surplus and zones of deficit? So maybe there are possibilities of surplus when poverty can be abolished for a society or for a community for a month or for a few months.
No, yeah, I mean, in a sense, that is one of the things which this Asian Development Bank's idea of vulnerability. If you factor in vulnerability, what you're asking is that how can we have a robust poverty level which will never fall below, regardless of droughts and famines and so on. And that is a very demanding standard, which is why half of Asian population is poor. What that means is that the poverty level is median income. In every society, median income is a poverty level. You see, in the European Union, 60% of median income is a poverty level. You can say, but forget about all this calorie business. Just say, if 50% is the median income, we will say, if the median income is low, everybody up to that is poor. So, but my view is that we have many very interesting debates on measurement. We really have now to get out and get away from a single measure. A variable measure, seasonally, generationally, over time. At all times, what can we do to minimize? At some time it may be 5%, other times it may be 40%. Again, a politician knows that if there is a drought or a famine, he has to do something special. He cannot say, well, you are above poverty line, so aapko kuch nahi milega. Everybody is below poverty line when there is famine. So, these sorts of sense we have to integrate into our anti-poverty program. There's lots of questions. Yeah, keep it short, yeah. And then I'll come.
Sir, this is in continuation with what Ghanshyam was asking. In fact, when I was coming to listen to you, I was just thinking that is poverty going to be somewhat like polio? See, we have eradicated polio. Then I thought that maybe one day I'll open Oxford English Dictionary and I'll find the word poverty is not there.
Yeah.
But then I was reminded that perhaps poverty of ideas will always be there. But the point is, sir, that after listening to you, I get the impression is very clear that poverty is not going to be abolished, nor is it going to be eradicated. It is income elastic, it is conscience elastic, it is semantics elastic, and now we are talking about vulnerabilities, which would include just about anyone. The new UNDP report also is primarily focused on vulnerability. But my point is, sir, that poverty should somehow be defined in a manner which is rigorous, because ultimately what are we trying to do? We are trying to target benefit, we are wanting to target welfare activities to a certain group of people whom we think that should not be allowed to suffer some kind of destitution.
Yeah, absolutely.
When you are so elastic in defining poverty, ultimately what is happening? The whole thing is being skimmed off at the top, and the guy who's at the bottom, the destitute, he is still suffering.
Well, I entirely agree. In this, as a sort of the burden of my discussion this afternoon is we must keep at the back of our mind the simplest measure which tells us that nobody should starve. We must never lose that. No matter how ambitious we are in our poverty level, we must never lose that. We must always make sure at all times that that is met. And then we can be aspirational. in how much we will allow for. But not forgetting that thing. No, I mean, again, as societies get better, people's aspiration rise, and not just for themselves. It is a question of distribution, but because in poverty relief, public resources are involved, public resources have to be used carefully and economically. So you must have standards which say, okay, this is what's really urgent. And we must at least do that, and then there are aspirations. And those two, I think if you want to convince people that they should pay a higher tax, they have to agree with the aspirational. They may all agree with the minimum, pay tax for that. But they may not be willing to pay tax for the aspirational. So you have to take society together. No, I think I'm going to go at the back. Can we have the mic at the back? Because I think this is the tyranny of the front row must be resisted. Yes. And after that, this lady, yeah, please.
Professor Desai, thank you for your lecture. In the context of your topic, I'll just ask you the old classic question of circularity. Do we need to improve governance, Professor Desai, in order to abolish poverty, or do we need to abolish poverty in order to improve governance? Because on the one hand, you have Western countries which rue the fact that they pour in trillions of dollars into countries in Africa and they see no results at all. And you have institutions like the World Bank and the IMF who are accused of pouring in those resources without at all bothering about whether those enabling institutions at all exist at the ground level in order to successfully implement those policies. But on the other hand, you also have superstars.
I get the drift of this.
Right.
I think, it is a simultaneous process. Just take India as an example. People's awareness of the need for good governance has been a function of such prosperity as has come. People, even the poor people, are more aware of their rights now than they used to be when I was a teenager. Because the country was much poorer, we had fewer means of even protesting. At the same time, poverty has, to the extent that poverty has reduced, it has been to the fact that the governance, while it goes up and down, has always been concerned with that problem. There's no political party in India which can afford to neglect that question of poverty. So I think in a sense, we'll have to do both. You can't say, my priority is abolishing poverty, let governance wait. No, that will not happen, because you need good governance. But as I said, governance is sort of not a given thing. I now come to India quite frequently, and the degree to which people are using RTI, the degree to which people are willing to register protests about atrocities, harassments, things like that, it was completely unknown, 50 years ago. People were much too tolerant, they just suffered in silence. They will not suffer in silence. And governance will improve when the demand for good governance grows. And that will grow when people have this. So I think they are both very difficult, they are both very good. But certain institutions, for example, can permanently change. Like I was saying about Obamacare. Now, Obamacare has come very late into a prosperous society. It took a big fight to get it done. But now that it has been done, it will make an enormous difference. I mean, the one thing I know about the UK is we have a National Health Service. And ultimately, because health is free, health treatment is free, that removes a great item of expenditure from the burden of ordinary families. Then you can ask, well, is everybody getting equal treatment and so on and so forth? But so that sort of good governance would immensely help in removing poverty, just as free primary education of good quality, I should say, etc. So yeah, there is a mutual dynamic there. There's a lady there who wanted to ask a question.
We only have about 10 minutes left for questions, so maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
At the back there, can I ask? There's a lady there. Can she ask a question? Hello? There. Yeah.
Hello, sir. As we know that poverty and unemployment are interlinked concept. So if unemployment is removed or reduced, then poverty can also be abolished.
Yeah, reducing, let me put it this way. Having a growth strategy which is employment generating is always one of the ingredients of an anti-poverty policy. One of India's problem has been that because we've had a stagnant manufacturing sector for many, many years, there are 50 to 60% of the population living in rural areas. Now, if you look at national income data, output per worker is highest in services, then in manufacturing, and lowest in agriculture. What means a lot of people are trapped in low productivity jobs, if they have jobs at all. So one anti-poverty strategy would be to move them and give them productive jobs which give them not Narega like 100 days work, but 300 days work per year. That's only manufacturing can do, nothing else can do that. So you're quite right that to have a employment generating strategy would be a very good anti-poverty device. Yeah.
We have been eulogizing the achievements of LPG over the years. In India, there has been high growth rates, but there is no jobs. So there is jobless growth. At the most, there is casualization of jobs and contractualization of jobs. And thirdly, there is also feminization of poverty. What is your view on this?
No, I mean, you see, from the beginning, the people who started us on our development path were good people, they were honest people, there's not doubt their sincerity. But they were very much obsessed about national self-sufficiency of the industrial structure. They wanted machines to make machines so that then we can have no dependence upon foreign capital and so on. That kind of growth strategy does not generate jobs. It generates jobs for skilled workers. It doesn't generate jobs for unskilled people. And so we had a growth strategy which for decades, not only was the growth rate low, but it only generated jobs for IITs and things like that, but not for your unskilled manual male or female worker. And so we got to get out of the strategy. And I have been fighting for God knows how many years about changing labor laws in manufacturing. And again, the answer has been, I'm just very right-wing and there's nothing wrong with our labor laws. Our labor laws were meant to protect 5% of the total labor force, which works in formal sector. But they have an effect of discouraging the growth of manufacturing, which countries like Bangladesh and Malaysia and Indonesia have managed without harming their workers. There is this idea that to change labor laws is going to be horrible to workers. No, we got to make employment generation a big priority of our growth strategy. And now we're again discussing that. I have no faith that we will really move to that, because that requires a very different kind of mindset. From the mindset we have got into a very risk-averse strategy. If we have a thing in UK, we say, if you protect jobs, you will not create employment. You will only end up protecting the jobs you have, you will not generate more jobs. And you just have to look at the experience of Bangladesh, or Indonesia, or Malaysia, and you realize how many things we are doing wrong. So I quite agree with you. Jobless growth is the enemy, but to get growth strategy which can generate jobs requires much more bolder economic thinking than we have got so far. I think I'm going to take two more questions. Raise up all the hands and I'll see. There are persons everywhere. Oh, yeah. That lady is there. And then that person there.
Great lecture on the topic of poverty.
No, not you. That lady there. Gender justice, come on. Sorry. Just having a mic doesn't entitle you to ask a question.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Sashi from Nalanda University, and I'm curious to know if the poverty eradication and corruption can be separated. If we take it as an assumption that the corruption can't be discredited, so in that case, poverty eradication can be effective.
No, I think corruption has some effect, but I don't think we should use that as an excuse for not eliminating poverty. Okay? Eliminating corruption, don't get me on that. I think eliminating corruption in India is a very, very difficult problem. It's more difficult than eliminating poverty. Let me put it that way. We will eliminate poverty before we eliminate corruption in India. The gentleman, yeah.
We got a view of poverty from the kind of, I would say, a very great height. We have tried to look at the problem of poverty, which we see at the grassroots. I'll just share one experience and then put my question. Driving through the roads of Patna, I felt one day, and I'm actually doing it, carrying a plastic bag of some coins, because at every crossing when the car stops, there are few people
begging,
who come and stand near the glass door. I start looking for a coin, I don't get it, so I have now devised a way of satisfying my conscience that I'm not the one who is grabbing everything from the society. Let me give something out of it. Sometimes I have given even 10, and sometimes I have not found any, then I have given 100 also, never before, never more than. What I'm saying is this: why is this population coming into the cities?
Because people like to give them money.
Right.
Perfect incentive.
Perfect incentive. Then, what is happening, and I read somewhere that in the course of next 30 years or so, nearly 6 billion people will be living in the cities. That's a kind of thing which you as economist would know more. I'm a non-economist, I don't understand much. But I wanted to hear what kind of policies which were made for the benefit of the poor and which have not benefited the poor.
Yeah, but I'm ultimately an optimist in that regard. I'm not worried about population growth at all. Within my lifetime, the population of India has trebled. And within my lifetime, the average Indian has got better off. Both those things are true. In 1940, I was born in 1940, 1941, we used to say, Hindi hai hum 40 crore. And that was undivided India. Undivided India had 400 million people. Now undivided India has 2 billion people. Right? So population has grown, per capita income has grown, and while there are more visible poor, the people who come to Patna and stand outside your car are not the poorest people in the world. They're probably, if you measure their income, they may be even above the poverty line. What I'm saying is, be optimistic. I think population growth is not a bad thing. Urbanization is not a bad thing. It makes poverty more visible, yes, but it also makes it more urgent to solve it. But we mustn't forget the rural poor. We must not forget the invisible poor. And giving poor people money is not the answer to, individually. The way to cure poverty is not giving and of course people are free to give money, but give people the conditions in which they can get out of poverty. I know. You see, once upon a time, you're perfectly free to do that. People should do whatever they want to do. But what I'm saying, that is not a poverty relieving strategy. You know, that is a conscious relieving strategy. It's not a poverty relieving strategy. You know, once upon a time there used to be a Bollywood song called Ek Paisa De De. Now they say 10 rupiya de de. That is progress. I think that's it. I'm told I'm rationed, so I can't do any further.
I'm sure there are a lot more questions, but as always, we are constrained for time. Also, I'm sure all of us want to hear a policymaker's perspective on this, so I'd like to now invite Shri Nitish Kumar ji to the dais.
लॉर्ड मेघनाथ देसाई जी, शैवाल गुप्ता जी, अंजन मुखर्जी साहब, पीपी घोष जी, सामने बैठे हुए वित्त मंत्री श्री विजेंद्र प्रसाद यादव जी, जल संसाधन मंत्री श्री विजय कुमार चौधरी जी, खान मंत्री श्री रामलखन रमन जी, नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय की कुलपति गोपा सबरवाल जी, मैं शैवाल गुप्ता जी को सचेत करना चाहता हूं, करेक्ट करना चाहता हूं। ये अक्सर हाँ नालंदा यूनिवर्सिटी को नालंदा इंटरनेशनल यूनिवर्सिटी बोल देते हैं। ऐसा लगता है कि कोई कॉम्प्लेक्स के शिकार हैं ये। नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय अपने आप में इंटरनेशनल है, उसमें इंटरनेशनल शब्द जोड़ने की जरूरत नहीं, क्योंकि विश्वविद्यालय का नाम सिर्फ और सिर्फ नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय। इसलिए नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय की कुलपति गोपा सबरवाल जी, नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय के सभी फैकल्टी मेंबर्स, स्टूडेंट्स और यहाँ उपस्थित सभी विशिष्ट अतिथिगण, प्रिंट और इलेक्ट्रॉनिक मीडिया के प्रतिनिधिगण, देवियों और सज्जनों, मैं शैवाल गुप्ता जी को सबसे पहले धन्यवाद देता हूं कि उन्होंने आदरी फाउंडेशन लेक्चर में जब लॉर्ड मेघनाथ देसाई जी को आमंत्रित किया बोलने के लिए, तो इस अवसर पर मुझे भी उपस्थित रहने का हुक्म इन्होंने दिया। मैं इसके लिए मैं शुक्रगुजार हूं और आज यहाँ वाकई उपस्थित होकर बेहद खुशी हुई है, क्योंकि मैं हमेशा लॉर्ड मेघनाथ देसाई जी को सुनना चाहता हूं और जब भी ये बोलते हैं अपनी एक ऊंचाई से बोलते हैं, जो एक बौद्धिक स्तर है, इंटेलेक्चुअल लेवल है, उस स्तर से बोलते हैं, तो संभव है बहुत सारे लोगों को जिस तरह की बात वो सुनना चाहते हैं वैसी बात ये शायद नहीं सुना पाते हो, लेकिन मुझे हमेशा इनको सुनना अच्छा लगता है, तो आज मुझे फिर प्रसन्नता हुई है। लेकिन मैं सबसे पहले इनको बधाई देना चाहता हूँ आज के अच्छे भाषण के लिए सिर्फ नहीं, बल्कि इस बात के लिए भी कि नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय जिसके बोर्ड ऑफ गवर्नर्स के सदस्य हैं, और अगर ये मैं कहूँ कि मेरे विशेष आग्रह पर ही इन्होंने अपना समय देना प्रारंभ किया नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय के लिए और उसकी स्थापना के लिए, इन्होंने हर स्तर पर सहयोग किया, पूरी कोशिश की, मेहनत की, समय दिया और अंततोगत्वा नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय ने काम करना शुरू कर दिया। तो इनको भी बधाई है और गोपा सबरवाल जी को बधाई है। मैंने गोपा जी के माध्यम से वहाँ के स्टूडेंट्स और तमाम लोगों को, फैकल्टी मेंबर्स और बोर्ड, चांसलर, सबको उनके माध्यम से हमने बधाई दी है। ये कोई मामूली बात नहीं। मुझे आज भी वो दिन याद है जब पिछली बार प्रोफेसर अमर्त्य सेन आए थे और नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय की कुछ समस्याएं थीं, उस पर वो हम लोगों का सहयोग चाहते थे। यूँ तो हम लोगों का सहयोग सदैव था और जो भी ज़रूरत हुई उसको पूरा करने की कोशिश राज्य ने की। तो उस समय जब इन्होंने मुझको बताया कि 1 सितंबर से हम लोग, शायद उनका एक स्टेटमेंट भी आ गया था, तो मैंने ही पूछा था कि आपका हमने देखा 1 सितंबर से शुरू होगा, तो उन्होंने कहा कि ज़रूर शुरू होगा। तो हमने कहा अगर 1 सितंबर से क्लास शुरू हो जाएगा तो राज्य सरकार यूनिवर्सिटी को एंडाउमेंट के तौर पर 100 एकड़ ज़मीन देगी। क्योंकि इंडोमेंट के लिए कमेटी भी नालंदा यूनिवर्सिटी के गवर्निंग बोर्ड ने बनाया, लेकिन अब उससे कुछ खास हासिल नहीं हुआ। तो हमने सोचा कि शुरुआत यहीं से है तो राज्य सरकार को करना चाहिए, तो उसके लिए 100 एकड़ जमीन पहले ही से एक्वायर करके चिन्हित करके रखी हुई है। तो अब नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय का काम शुरू हो गया, और शायद हम भी नहीं रहे जब नालंदा विश्वविद्यालय सचमुच फुल्ली फंक्शनल हो जाएगा और जो सपना है उसके मुताबिक वो काम करने लगेगा। लेकिन विश्वविद्यालय का ये 800 साल के बाद इतिहास ने करवट ली। ये कोई मामूली घटना नहीं, ये एक बहुत बड़ी घटना है। और उसी सप्ताह आप यहाँ पधारे हैं, तो इसके लिए आपका विशेष स्वागत है, आपका अभिनंदन है। और मैं उम्मीद करता हूँ कि ये काम जो आगे शुरू हो गया है आगे बढ़ता जाएगा, और बहुत तेज़ी से जो 7 स्कूल स्थापित होने वो सभी होंगे। अभी तो 2 स्कूल से काम प्रारंभ हुआ है और नालंदा से ही प्रारंभ हो गया, तो ये बड़ी खुशी की बात है। और दूसरी, जिस पॉवर्टी, गरीबी के विषय पर आपने परिचर्चा आयोजित की है, अब मुझे अभी भी याद है 2007 में बिहार सरकार के इनिशिएटिव पर एक इंटरनेशनल सेमिनार किया गया था, जिसका जिक्र सहवाल गुप्ता जी ने अपने इंट्रोडक्टरी रिमार्क में भी किया। पॉवर्टी मेजरमेंट, आइडेंटिफिकेशन एंड इरेडिकेशन, इन तीनों चीज़ों को जोड़ते हुए विषय रखा गया था, और उस पर बाहर से भी लोग आए, देश भर से भी लोग आए, और एक पटना डिक्लेरेशन जारी हुआ था। और ये समस्या है, गरीब कौन है, उनकी पहचान करना, एक तो उसका आधार बनाना, और आज आपने उसके बहुत ठीक ढंग से उसके विभिन्न पहलुओं को सामने रखा है। ये ठीक है, कंपैरेटिव चीज़ भी है, इसमें रीजनल वेरिएशंस भी हैं, सोसाइटी का एक एस्पिरेशन भी है, बहुत सारी चीज़ें, ये सब चीज़ें प्रासंगिक। लेकिन जो एक बेयर मिनिमम नीड है, न्यूनतम आवश्यकता जो मनुष्य की है, वह है खाने की, वह है वस्त्र की पहनने की, वह है रहने की, यानी भोजन, कपड़ा, मकान, और उसके साथ 2 चीज़ और, शिक्षा और स्वास्थ्य। ये मेरी समझ से आज के संदर्भ में बेयर मिनिमम रिक्वायरमेंट्स। और हो सकता है कि इसको अगर मनी टर्म में हम कैलकुलेट करेंगे तो रीजनल वेरिएशंस होंगे। अगर कोई मुंबई में इन चीज़ों को मेजर करना चाहेगा तो उसकी कीमत ज़्यादा होगी पटना की तुलना में, ये स्वीकार करने वाली बात है, इसमें कोई शक नहीं। और देहाती इलाकों में कम पैसे में भी काम चल सकता है, ये एक अलग विषय है, वो अपनी जगह पर है। लेकिन पैसे के टर्म में जब हम उसको क्वांटिफाई करेंगे तो उसमें एक फ़र्क आ सकता है। लेकिन जहाँ तक आवश्यकता है उसमें कोई कमी नहीं की जा सकती। हर आदमी, हर इंसान को भोजन चाहिए। अब भोजन भी क्या चाहिए, जो कैलोरी की बात शुरू से की गई वो उस समय के लिए सही था, लेकिन आज हर क्षेत्र में जब हम पोषण की बात करते हैं, कुपोषण के खिलाफ लड़ रहे हैं, तो भोजन मिलना चाहिए, और पौष्टिक भोजन। इसके लिए बराबर कहा जाता है कि जेल मैनुअल में, आपने भी उसका जिक्र किया कि भाई एक जेल के कैदी को जितना खाना दिया जाता है वो न्यूनतम, मिनिमम है, उसको मान लीजिए। तो एक अलग विषय है, इसके बारे में और एक्सपर्ट सोच सकते हैं, उसको मनी टर्म में कैलकुलेट किया जा सकता है। लेकिन बुनियादी ज़रूरत है ठीक ढंग से जीने के लिए जो एक भोजन की ज़रूरत है, वह फिर व्यक्ति के हिसाब से वैरी करेगा। कोई ज़्यादा खाएगा, कोई कम खाएगा। कोई मेहनत करता है तो उसकी ज़रूरत ज़्यादा होगी, कोई मेहनत कम करता है या नहीं करता उसकी ज़रूरत कम होगी। वो एक अलग विषय है, उसको उस हिसाब से फैक्टर इन किया जा सकता है। लेकिन मिनिमम रिक्वायरमेंट है भोजन की, कपड़े की, आवास की, शिक्षा की और स्वास्थ्य की, ये जरूर होना चाहिए। और इसके बाद तो फिर रहने का अधिकार है, जीने का अधिकार है, और विथ डिग्निटी। मैंने इतनी न्यूनतम चीज़ों की बात इसलिए की कि साहब अब तो राइट टू एजुकेशन भी हो गया, अब कॉन्स्टिट्यूशनल राइट है, तो उसका रिक्वायरमेंट। इसको देखते हुए और इसके लिए स्वाभाविक तौर पर बहुत सारी चीजें सरकार को करनी होंगी, उसको पूरा करना होगा। कैसे उन तक पहुंचे वो एक अलग विषय है, वो एक इरेडिकेशन के चैप्टर में, लेकिन मेजरमेंट का जहां तक सवाल है वो इस आधार पर मेजर किया जाना चाहिए। और इसके बाद आइडेंटिफिकेशन का प्रश्न आता, हम कैसे आइडेंटिफाई करें लोगों को। मेरी समझ से ये आइडेंटिफिकेशन का मैंने 2007 में भी कहा था, अनेकों बार कहा है, आपके सामने भी कहना चाहता हूं कि मेजरमेंट का तो ये हाल है, आइडेंटिफिकेशन का, कि बिहार में केंद्र सरकार ने कहा कि 65 लाख परिवार ही गरीबी रेखा के नीचे हैं और टारगेटेड पब्लिक डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन में उसको शामिल किया। हम लोगों ने देखा जो उन्हीं के द्वारा सर्कुलेटेड था, रूरल डेवलपमेंट मिनिस्ट्री के द्वारा ही सर्कुलेटेड था, और अलग अलग जरूरतों पर उनके 52 इंडिकेटर्स थे और उसके आधार पर जो पॉइंट्स कैलकुलेट किए गए थे, हम लोगों ने बिहार में 13 पॉइंट को माना था कट ऑफ पॉइंट। तो उसके बाद भी 1,40,00,000 परिवार गरीबी रेखा के नीचे थे, लेकिन केंद्र सरकार ने नहीं माना। तो ये समस्या तो आइडेंटिफिकेशन का है। तो उस समय से ही मैं एक सुझाव देता हूं, और जब फूड सिक्योरिटी एक्ट बना उस समय भी हम लोगों ने बार बार कहा ये हमेशा आइडेंटिफिकेशन की समस्या रहेगी। इस आइडेंटिफिकेशन की समस्या का समाधान हो सकता है अगर हम एक इंडिपेंडेंट कमीशन बनाएं। आपने भी कहा अलग अलग दौर में 70 के दशक से बहुत पहले भी दादा भाई नौरोजी ने इस पर काम किया, लेकिन आप देखें तो स्ट्रक्चर्ड काम 70 के दशक से शुरू हुआ, हर बार उसमें परिवर्तन आया। तो इसके लिए हमेशा कोशिश होनी चाहिए। आपने कहा 5 साल, पटना डिक्लेरेशन के बाद फिर से तेंदुलकर साहब को काम दिया गया, या फिर एनसी सक्सेना ने भी कुछ काम इस पर किया, तो एक नए फिगर आए सामने। तो जरूरत इस बात की है कि इसके लिए एक निरंतर इवैल्यूएशन होना चाहिए, मेजरमेंट का इंडेक्स भी बने और उसके लिए एक्सपर्ट शामिल हो सकते हैं, और फिर जो भी इंडेक्स है उसके हिसाब से जो भी हम मेजरमेंट का तरीका तय करते हैं उसके आधार पर उनका आइडेंटिफिकेशन होना चाहिए। क्योंकि इरेडिकेशन होगा जब टारगेटेड लोगों तक आप सहायता पहुंचाएंगे। तो उसके लिए जरूरी है कि एक इंडिपेंडेंट कमीशन हो, और जब तक इंडिपेंडेंट कमीशन नहीं होगा ये चलता रहेगा, जिसको कहते हैं आपस में सेंटर स्टेट में फिर डिफरेंट पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज के बीच में। आप किसी राज्य में चले जाइए, किसी पार्टी की सरकार, जो सरकार में है वो कहेगा कि हमारे यहाँ बिल्कुल लिस्ट ठीक है बीपीएल का, लेकिन दूसरे लोग कहेंगे कि यहाँ बीपीएल लिस्ट में गरीबों का नाम छूटा हुआ है, अमीरों का नाम शामिल है। ये बिल्कुल पेट सेंटेंस है, आप चले जाइए कहीं भी। रूलिंग पार्टी के लोग कहने को मजबूर हैं, ये कहेंगे कि साहब इसमें सबका नाम है, अगर कोई छूट गया है तो जोड़ दिया जाएगा। दूसरे लोग कहेंगे कि साहब ये भयंकर लिस्ट तैयार हुआ। ये समस्या होती है सेंटर स्टेट के बीच में, डिफरेंट पॉलिटिकल पार्टीज के बीच में, ये चलता रहता है। इसके लिए जरूरत इस बात की है कि इंडिपेंडेंट कमीशन बने, और जब इंडिपेंडेंट कमीशन बनेगा तो उसका 2 काम हो सकता है। एक मेजरमेंट के का आधार क्या हो ये तय हो सकता है, और उसके आधार पर आइडेंटिफिकेशन होगा। तब इसके उन्मूलन के लिए सरकार की तरफ से जो पहल की जाए वो बेनिफिशियरी को पहुंच सके, मिल सके, तो ये होना चाहिए। और इसके साथ ही मैं समझता हूं कि आपने बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण बात कही है, और एक बात आपने जो कही है जो आमतौर पर जिस पर ध्यान नहीं जाता है कि जैसे जैसे ग्रोथ हो रहा है वैसे वैसे पॉवर्टी बढ़ रही है। इसका अर्थ आपका यह नहीं है कि 70 के स्टैंडर्ड के हिसाब से बढ़ रही है, उस आधार पर बढ़ रही है, लेकिन जैसे जैसे ग्रोथ होता है वैसे वैसे लोगों के एस्पिरेशंस बढ़ते हैं। तो कई चीज़ें हैं, और इसके लिए मैं समझता हूं कि आपने एक बात कही है कि जितना पर कैपिटा इनकम यानी ओवरऑल जो एक कहिए जीडीपी है, ग्रॉस डोमेस्टिक प्रोडक्ट है, उसी का डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन होता है लोगों पर, तो पर कैपिटा इनकम हम कैलकुलेट कर लेते हैं। तो जब जीडीपी बढ़ रहा है, लेकिन ये इस बात को साफ तौर पर प्रमाणित करता है आपके इस कथन से कि इस देश में या दुनिया में भी ये जो डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की समस्या है ये बहुत जटिल है। एक तरफ ग्रोथ हो रहा है, उसका लाभ कुछ लोगों को मिल रहा है, लेकिन बहुत बड़ी आबादी उससे वंचित रह जाती है। और यहाँ तक कि जो लोगों को सहारा देने के लिए जो कुछ स्कीम्स चलाई जाती है, सब्सिडी दी जाती है, वह भी लोगों तक ठीक ढंग से नहीं पहुँच पाती। तो जो सवाल है वो इक्विटी का है, बराबरी का है, लोगों तक पहुँचे, समानता का प्रश्न है, और दूसरा गवर्नेंस का भी प्रश्न इन सब चीज़ों से जुड़ा हुआ है। ये कोई चीज़ अलग अलग प्रश्न नहीं है, एक दूसरे से जुड़े हुए प्रश्न हैं। और ग्रोथ का जो नज़रिया है ये दुनिया भर में डिबेट का विषय है। ग्रोथ का नज़रिया तो वही होगा, हम तुरंत प्रभावित हो जाते हैं कि बहुत ज़्यादा निवेश आ रहा है और हम इसको नहीं देखते हैं कि वो निवेश कहाँ कहाँ आ रहा है। समाज के लोगों के बीच में डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन की बात तो छोड़ दीजिए, कंट्री के डिफरेंट रीजन में भी डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन नहीं। आप जहाँ बैठे हैं बिहार पिछड़ा हुआ किस चीज़ का शिकार है? रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी का शिकार है। इस देश के अंदर ही अगर आप दिल्ली को, मुंबई को, कई जगहों को आप देखेंगे तो आप पाएंगे कि काफ़ी बड़ा अंतर है। और जो नई पहल की भी जाती है उसमें भी पैसे कहाँ जाएंगे? वो पैसे उन्हीं जगहों पर जाएंगे। कहावत है पैसा पैसे को आकर्षित करता है, तो जहाँ पैसा है वहीं और पैसा जाने वाला है। तो मैं तो समझता हूँ कि जो ये समस्या है गैर बराबरी की वो और जटिल होने वाली है। इसलिए डेवलपमेंट का क्या तरीका होगा, विकास का क्या तरीका होगा, इसमें देश के अंदर विभिन्न हिस्सों के बारे में सोच होना चाहिए। रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी खत्म होनी चाहिए। ये विकास के कुछ द्वीप नहीं बनने चाहिए। मैं देख रहा हूँ अपने देश में भी विकास के कुछ द्वीप बन रहे हैं, और वैसे द्वीप और बने और वो मजबूत हों, उसी का जश्न हो रहा या जश्न मनाने की कोशिश होती। विकास हर कोने तक पहुंचे, हर राज्य की तरक्की हो। आज ठीक है हमारे यहाँ कम पैसे में लोगों का काम चल जाता है, चूंकि अभी हम पिछड़े हैं, तो इसका लाभ भले ही हो सकता है कि हमारे यहाँ गरीब का गुजारा कम में ही हो जाएगा। लेकिन आप कल्पना करिए कि आखिर ये स्थिति क्यों? हम गैर बराबरी के शिकार हैं, रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी के शिकार हैं। इसलिए गरीबी का एक रिश्ता, जो आपने कहा रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी, तो उससे भी यह प्रश्न जुड़ा हुआ है कि आखिर इतने बड़े पैमाने पर रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी क्यों? एक देश के अंदर इतने वर्षों के बाद भी इतनी रीजनल डिस्पैरिटी क्यों? तो ये सारे प्रश्न हैं, उससे जुड़े हुए प्रश्न हैं। लेकिन अंततोगत्वा गरीबी तो अभिशाप है, इसका उन्मूलन होना ही चाहिए। और सचमुच जब पहली बार हमने विषय देखा तो मैं भी 1 मिनट के लिए घबरा गया, क्योंकि इससे ध्वनि निकलती है कि साहब ये कभी होगा ही नहीं खत्म। तो ठीक है, गरीबी कई चीज़ों की होती है। गरीबी धन की भी हो सकती है, गरीबी मन की भी हो सकती है। तो मन की गरीबी तो के शिकार तो कहीं नहीं हम सब लोग हो रहे हैं कि भाई कभी गरीबी दूर ही नहीं होगी। मेरी मान्यता है कि गरीबी दूर जरूर होगी। आपने कहा कि इस धरती से में इतनी शक्ति है, जो गांधी जी की उक्ति को शुभमूर्ति जी ने कोट किया कि इतनी शक्ति है कि वो बहुत कुछ दे सकता है। लेकिन हम लोगों को देख लेना चाहिए कि हम क्या इतने स्वार्थी होते जा रहे हैं कि धरती से बहुत कुछ खींचना चाहते हैं, लेकिन धरती को देना क्या चाह रहे हैं? पर्यावरण को भी नष्ट करते चले जा रहे हैं। तो यह भी देखना होगा कि अंततोगत्वा कभी ना कभी तो धरती कुपित होगी और हम सब लोगों का अस्तित्व समाप्त हो जाएगा। तो इसलिए मेरी समझ से गरीबी का तो खात्मा होना ही होगा, गरीबी को तो समाप्त करना ही होगा। आप जिस डेमोक्रेसी की बात कह रहे हैं, अगर गरीबी खत्म नहीं होगी तो लोग इस बात को कोई स्वीकार नहीं करेगा। तो ख़त्म होना ही चाहिए और इसके लिए नीतियाँ उसी तरह की होनी चाहिए। और ये हम सब लोगों का दुर्भाग्य है कि कई दशक से डिबेट चल रहा है कि गरीब किसे कहेंगे, लेकिन गरीब जिसे भी कहें एक न्यूनतम आधार तो तय हो ही जाना चाहिए। और मैंने मानता हूं कि जो हमारे जितने अर्थशास्त्रियों ने इस क्षेत्र में, समाजशास्त्रियों ने और विशेषज्ञों ने काम किया है, उन्होंने कोई कोताही की है, उन्होंने काम किया, वाकई काम किया। लेकिन ज़रूरत इस बात की है कि मन की गरीबी को ख़त्म करें और एक न्यूनतम बिंदु पर पहुंच जाए कि ये इतना तो मिनिमम नीड्स है, सबको मिलेगा ही, और उसी दिशा में पॉलिसी आगे बढ़नी चाहिए। लेकिन आकर आपने यहाँ एक बहुत ही बुनियादी प्रश्न पर अपने विचार रखे और हम सब लोगों को सुनने का मौका मिला, और हर बार की तरह इस बार भी आपको सुनना बहुत ही अच्छा लगा। मैं आपको बेहतरीन भाषण के लिए बधाई देता हूं। और सहवाल गुप्ता जी तो फाउंडेशन लेक्चर कराते हैं, इसके लिए बहुत बधाई। और आगे इनके जो कार्यक्रम हैं अगले 2 वर्षों के बारे में जिसकी भी इन्होंने चर्चा की है, इस बात की खुशी है और मेरी पूरी शुभकामना है। और जो कोई मान्यता इन्हें मिली है जिसका इन्होंने उल्लेख किया, हम सब लोगों ने ताली बजाई। भाई आप जब बताए कि मान्यता मिली है तो कुछ मुझको अटपटा लगा, ताली हमने बजा दी, क्योंकि आप बोल रहे थे तो आपके को प्रोत्साहित करने के लिए ताली बजा दी। हमने कहा कि ऐसी मान्यताओं से हम तो समझते हैं कि आपका आदरी ऊपर हो चुका है। बहुत लोग मान्यता देते हैं, लेकिन जो मान्यता देने वाले हैं उससे आप ऊपर हो गए हैं, इसलिए मन की गरीबी से निकलिए, सबसे बड़ी जरूरत इस बात की। बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद।
We would now like to request you to give a memento to Lord Desai.
Respected Sri Nitish Kumar ji, President of this gathering, respected Lord Meghnad Desai, Chief Guest in this afternoon, Dr. Shaival Gupta, Professor Anjan Mukherjee, and ladies and gentlemen. At the end of this Adri Foundation Lecture 2014, it is my proud privilege to propose a vote of thanks. To begin with, I first express my gratitude on my own behalf as well as on behalf of the Adri Institute to Honorable Sri Nitish Kumar ji for presiding over the function. He is one of those rare personalities whose political occupations run parallel to his academic interests, and we had a glimpse of that interest when he made his presidential remarks. Sir, we are all grateful to you not only for being with us this afternoon, but the valuable support you have always given us for Adri. For Lord Meghnad Desai, who had delivered the Adri Foundation lecture this afternoon, our gratitude is enormous. Unlike many other academicians, Lord Desai is an economist who had always struck a fine balance between theoretical issues and applied economics. In today's lecture, his analysis of this phenomenon of poverty was at once comprehensive, minute, and precise. It is not possible to prepare such an analysis without a mind that is sharp and without a heart that is sensitive. His considered observation on poverty are a caution for the over-optimist at one end and probably a critic of the cynics at the other end. We are all grateful to you for this lecture, and which freed us from many of the misconceptions about poverty. Friends, I now thank all of you in the audience who have attended our function. In particular, I express my gratitude Sri Vijay Kumar Chaudhary ji, Sri Vijayendra Yadav ji, Sri Ramlakhan Raman ji, Sri Harivansh ji, Professor Gopal Sabharwal, and many senior administrators of the state government. We consider your presence here as an indicator of your moral support for our organization. We sincerely value that support and thank you for the same. I am also thankful to the members of the media who are here to cover the function. Hopefully, through them, the contents of our foundation lecture will reach a much wider audience. At the end, let me also thank my colleagues at ADRI, without naming them individually, who have worked very hard during the last couple of days to make this function a success. Thanks are also due to the staff of Hotel Moria